When we picture a medieval king, we usually imagine him fixed in one place. A throne room, a council chamber, a battlefield. It can feel as if his life was nothing but petitions, punishments, treaties, and war. An endless chain of noise and responsibility. But tonight, we're stepping away from the loud history and into the quieter hours most chronicles rush past. The hours when the crown loosened, the body demanded air and movement, and a ruler, never fully private, never fully free, still searched for something like rest. Before we begin, I'd love to make this a shared, late-night journey. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening from right now, and what time is it where you are? Is this a calm evening for you, or the start of a long night? However your day has been, this documentary is designed to be sleep-friendly. Slow, atmospheric, and gentle. Something you can simply listen to without having to stay alert. And because this story lives in the details, everything you'll hear is drawn from reputable historical research on medieval court life, scholarly studies, primary accounts, and well-established works used by historians. I've listed the full sources in the video description for anyone who wants to explore further. Now settle in. Lower the lights if you can. And if you enjoy this kind of quiet history, subscribe so you don't miss the next parts in this series. Because once we leave the throne room behind, an entirely different medieval world begins to unfold. It was a machine built to keep power visible. Rooms were arranged like layers of access. The open spaces where many eyes could watch, then narrower chambers where only approved faces were admitted, and finally the innermost rooms where attendance became a privilege. Even there, true solitude was rare. Servants carried messages, tended fires, guarded doors, and moved quietly as shadows, because the king's comfort was itself a public matter. In such a world, leisure could not be only rest. It had to be a change of environment strong enough to interrupt the court's constant pressure. That is why outdoor pursuits mattered so much. They pulled the king away from the architecture of watching and being watched. They reduced paperwork to silence, at least for a while, and replaced the language of requests with the language of terrain. The hunt also offered a kind of privacy that did not depend on locked doors. A king could ride with a chosen circle, speak in motion, and let the noise of hooves and wind swallow words that should not be overheard. He could look forward instead of being looked at. For a man whose identity was always being interpreted, that shift alone could feel like relief. And because the hunt was expected, almost a duty of noble life, it provided escape without appearing like with ownership of space. In many realms, the king's forest was not simply woodland. It was a legal concept, a protected zone where the crown claimed special rights over land, animals, and access. That claim carried real weight. It told nobles where privilege ended, and it told commoners where punishment could begin. To step into those woods with bow or spear without authorization could mean ruin. This was not only about food or sport, it was about asserting a hierarchy so deeply that it reached into the habits of daily survival. And so, when a king rode into a forest with attendants and hounds, the scene communicated more than leisure. It announced control over territory, over resources, over the right to take life. The forest became a stage where power looked natural, as if rulership were as unquestionable as winter frost. Yet the king also experienced something personal there. Court life demanded restraint, measured speech, measured expressions, measured reactions. The woods allowed a different posture. The king could be loud without scandal, decisive without debate, physically exhausted without seeming weak. And because everyone present understood the symbolism, each successful pursuit became a story that strengthened the image of rule. A sovereign who could command men in stone halls could also command himself in closer to a campaign than to a casual ride. Long before the king appeared, people worked. Scouts reading tracks, handlers checking gear, keepers watching animal patterns, servants arranging provisions, and riders mapping the day's movement like a flowing route through trees and clearings. The hunt had roles and ranks just like the court. Some drove game forward, some guarded boundaries, some managed the dogs. Some ensured that the king reached the best position at the right time. Even excitement was organized. Horn calls signaled changes, warnings, and successes. They turned a messy landscape into an event with structure. The king's place within that structure mattered. He might not always strike the final blow, but the ceremony often guided opportunity toward him, because his success was everyone's success. A clean kill reinforced the image of competence. Steady hands, quick judgment, courage under sudden movement. That mattered in a world where rulers were expected to lead armies, not merely fund them. And yet, despite the planning, the forest could still surprise. A stag could vanish into thick cover. A boar could break a line. A horse could stumble. The unpredictability gave the day its thrill, and gave the king a rare chance to meet uncertainty without the lethal carried the same meaning. The great stag, tall and watchful, often represented the noblest pursuit. A test of patience, tracking, endurance, and the ability to read subtle signs in the landscape. The wild boar offered something harsher, could turn and charge, ripping into hounds, knocking riders off balance, forcing a hunter into a moment where skill and nerve had to fuse. Smaller game could fill lighter days, but the most celebrated hunts were those with risk and difficulty, because they translated easily into political myth. A king who faced danger calmly looked like a king who could face rebellion calmly. A king who hesitated looked, to some eyes, like a man who might hesitate elsewhere. The hunt therefore shaped reputations in ways that might seem unfair but were entirely believable to medieval observers. It also trained habits that mattered beyond sport. Managing a group in motion, making decisions with limited information, holding focus through fatigue, and staying composed when plans collapsed. In that sense, hunting was not a distraction from rulership. It was a parallel rehearsal of it, performed in a place where the rules were written by weather, by animal instinct, and by the turning of the ground were the hounds. Medieval hunting culture developed a deep practical knowledge of breeding, training, and specialization. Some dogs pursued by sight across open ground, quick as thrown spears. Others followed scent with stubborn devotion, patient enough to keep pressure for hours until an animal's strength began to fray. Whole staffs existed for these animals, feeding them, treating injuries, managing packs, and keeping temperament steady. A well-run kennel was an investment, and it showed. It also created an unexpected softness within the harsh symbolism of royal power. Many rulers formed genuine attachments to particular dogs, recognizing them as more than tools. A favored hound might be allowed closer than most humans, rewarded with choice scraps, spoken to in a voice that would never be used in council. In a life where almost every human interaction contained ambition, fear, or negotiation, an animal's loyalty could feel clean and uncomplicated. Even the discipline of working with hounds carried a lesson. The king could not simply command nature. He had to understand it, cooperate with it, and respect its limits. The best hunts were not brute force. They were a carefully balanced partnership between human planning and animal ability, and that balance, subtle, practiced, and earned, mirrored the kind of authority medieval kings wanted to believe. A different mood entirely, where the chase could be loud and crowded. Hunting with birds could feel quiet, refined, almost meditative. Imagine a cold morning with thin sunlight and open sky. The king stands still, glove on his arm, while a hooded falcon rests with contained energy. Alive, alert, and waiting. The hood is lifted, and the bird launches upward with sudden purpose, climbing into height and wind until it becomes a moving point against the light. Then, in a steep and decisive descent, it drops toward prey with speed that seems unreal. Falconry demanded patience and control. A hunting bird was not domesticated in the ordinary sense. It was persuaded, trained, and gradually bound by habit and reward. Could always choose to vanish. That made success feel like an achievement of relationship, not just of force. It also became a language of status. Rare birds were precious, difficult to obtain, and impressive to display. A ruler who owned exceptional hawks or falcons signaled reach, access to distant regions, skilled handlers, and wealth that could afford such fragile living treasures. In a courtly world, that kind of subtle display mattered as politics precisely because it did not look like politics. Invite a noble to ride beside you, and conversation flows differently than it does under tapestries and chandeliers. A request can be softened into a suggestion. A warning can be folded into a joke. A promise can be offered without scribes and witnesses. The movement of the day creates natural pauses, galloping bursts, quiet tracking, shared waits, where words can be measured and trust can be tested. A king could observe character without interrogation. Who stays calm when plans change, who grows reckless, who supports others, who complains. Alliances formed in these moments could be stronger than alliances formed in formal ceremonies, because they carried shared experience. The hunt, then, was a tool of social calibration, confirmed hierarchy while building bonds. It allowed the king to grant favors, an honored position, a chosen opportunity, a trophy given with a nod without writing a single decree. And it offered visiting guests a carefully shaped impression. A realm rich enough to protect great forests, organized enough to stage complex pursuits, and confident enough to turn wilderness into controlled spectacle. The return itself became part of the narrative. The procession back toward walls and towers carried trophies that would later hang as reminders. Antlers, tusks, pelts, objects that converted a fleeting moment into lasting evidence. Game might be prepared for the household, with portions distributed according to rank and custom, turning meat into a subtle map of favor. Stories of the chase would spread quickly, who struck true, whose horse faltered, which hound performed like a hero. And slowly the king re-entered the palace's other world. Warmth, torchlight, the scent of kitchens, the hum of waiting people. The forest's freedom faded into the structure of rooms and rules. Yet it left something behind. Loosened tension, satisfied appetite for movement, a refreshed mind, and an image reinforced in the eyes of those who mattered. In part 2, we move fully indoors, into the great halls where royal leisure becomes a different kind of theater, banquets, music, performance, and the careful choreography of prestige that could be as politically useful over the castle, and the last outdoor noise faded into distance. The palace changed its mood. The same walls that felt stern at midday could feel almost protective at night, holding warmth, torchlight, and the low, steady sound of people moving with purpose. This was the hour when royal leisure became indoor theater, less wild than the forest, but no less carefully shaped. A medieval banquet was not simply dinner. It was a slow unfolding of comfort and display, a way to turn a normal necessity, eating, into a calm demonstration that the realm was stable, ordered, and abundant. Guests arrived with their best manners ready, because every glance in a great hall carried meaning. The king did not need to announce authority loudly. The room itself did it for him. The height of the ceiling, the long tables, the placement of candles, the steady pace of service, everything suggested control. Yet for the ruler, this could still be a form of rest. After the physical exertion of riding and hunting, there was a different pleasure in sitting still, listening, letting the evening carry him forward on a current of music, food, and predictable ritual. Even the repetition of ceremony could be soothing, because it asked little improvisation. It began long before anyone sat down. Kitchens worked like hidden engines. Fires tended, meat turned, fish cleaned, bread baked. Sauces stirred slowly until they became glossy and fragrant. In an age without modern refrigeration, planning mattered, and skill mattered even more. Salt, smoke, drying, spicing, careful timing. These were not small tricks, but essential arts. The wealth of a court could be tasted in its ability to serve variety. Meats alongside fish, fresh herbs beside preserved fruits, sweet dishes after savory ones, warm bread arriving as if it had been waiting for that exact moment. Yet the most impressive part was not luxury alone, but coordination. A hall filled with guests could not be fed by accident. Servants moved in patterns, replacing dishes, refilling cups, clearing boards, never pausing long enough to become visible as individuals. Their invisibility was part of the illusion, that food and comfort simply appeared as naturally as candlelight. For a viewer, it felt like effortless plenty. For the king, it felt like a household functioning smoothly, an everyday reminder that order could be built, maintained, often arrived in waves. One course did not end the story. It opened space for the next. Platters could appear with roasted birds, carved meats, pies sealed in crust, stewed dishes dark with spice, and bowls of bright sauces meant to change the flavor of each bite. Sometimes the most striking dishes were designed for the eyes first, carefully shaped presentations that made guests pause before they tasted anything at all. In quieter moments, the king might watch the room more than the food, letting the rhythm settle him. A long banquet could be strangely calming because it had a predictable pace. It moved forward like a river, and everyone floated along, eating, sipping, speaking softly, listening when music rose, laughing when a performer offered something light. Even when politics hovered in the background, as it always did, the tone could be gentler than a council meeting. No one wanted to break the surface of the evening too sharply. So disagreements were wrapped in pleasant words, requests were softened into compliments, and ambition learned to speak quietly. Religious seasons brought fasting days when meat disappeared, replaced by fish and clever alternatives that still felt rich and satisfying. The passing year changed what could be served fresh and what needed preservation. For the court, these limits were not only restrictions, they were opportunities to show skill. A great household could make simple ingredients feel surprising through technique and careful seasoning. Spices, in particular, carried the scent of distance, pepper, cinnamon, cloves, small reminders that trade routes and royal finances reached far beyond the local market. Yet the banquet was not meant to overwhelm the senses with intensity. In a sleep-friendly telling, it is easier to imagine the softer side. Warm bread, mild cheese, fruit when available, honeyed sweets at the end, and wine or ale poured steadily but without hurry. The king, seated where he could be seen, did not need to eat quickly. He could eat slowly, letting the evening stretch, letting the day's sharp edges dissolve into inside these hours like a second fire. It filled the spaces that conversation left empty, and it smoothed transitions between courses. Instruments varied by region and period: strings, flutes, pipes, drums, but the purpose stayed the same. A gentle current of sound that kept the hall from feeling too large or too silent. Often the musicians sat slightly apart, sometimes raised, not to separate them in status, but to let their sound travel evenly. The best players understood pace. They could offer livelier tunes when the room felt restless, then soften into calmer melodies when the hall settled into a quieter mood. For the king, music was useful and restful at once. It was useful because it made the court look cultivated. It was restful because it asked nothing from him. He could simply listen. In a life where almost every moment demanded response, listening without obligation could feel like a rare luxury. Simple, quiet, music and deeply words. Human. Poems, praises, short stories, playful performances that carried the mind away from the day. Professional entertainers held an unusual position, welcomed, rewarded, yet always separate from the nobles they entertained. Their value was in atmosphere. They could turn a heavy room light, turn a long evening quick, and offer the king a way to appear generous without giving away land or titles. A well-timed compliment in verse could make a guest feel noticed. A familiar tale could make strangers feel like they belonged to the same moment. Even when stories were heroic or romantic, they did not need to be intense. They could be told softly, with repetition, with comforting rhythms, like a lullaby for adults who had spent all day guarding their expressions. The king might smile without explaining why. He might let the performance cover his fatigue. And if he was thoughtful, he could use the calm that storytelling created as a mask for observation, watching how people reacted when they forgot briefly when that it happened was less about wild movement than about measured grace. Steps were learned, patterns repeated, hands offered and released in polite sequence. The opening of a dance could belong to the highest-ranking figures, setting the tone for everyone else, not as a command but as a model. In a hall of strict hierarchy, dance allowed controlled closeness, people moving near each other with permission in a way everyday life rarely allowed. It also gave the night a soft shape. Music rising, bodies moving, then returning to seats, returning to conversation. For sleep, it helps to imagine it gently. The sound of shoes on wooden floors, the quiet rustle of fabric, the steady breathing of a room that is no longer tense. The king could participate or simply watch. Either choice carried meaning, yet neither required harsh effort. It was leisure that stayed indoors, safe from weather, safe from sudden danger, contained within as much as flavor. Where a guest sat signaled favor, and favor could change lives. Nearness to the king meant visibility, and visibility meant opportunity. Yet the evening did not need to feel sharp or cruel. Many nights were simply about maintaining balance, giving enough honor to keep allies content, avoiding insults that could grow into grudges, letting the court feel steady. Conversations drifted in small circles. News from distant lands, hints of upcoming journeys, quiet remarks about marriages, debts, and promises. The king could speak little and still be heard. He could speak warmly and still remain cautious. And as the meal moved toward its end, the hall often softened into a calmer hush. Fewer dishes, slower music, quieter voices. This was the banquet's hidden gift. Not only display, not only politics, but a structured landing after a demanding day. An elegant way to come down from exertion and return, gradually thinned. Stillness. Candles shortened. The busiest servants shifted to cleaning and quiet tasks, and the king's world narrowed again from the wide hall to smaller rooms. The public warmth of the banquet faded into private calm. This was when indoor leisure could become even simpler. A small group, a low fire, a board set on a table, pieces arranged with care. Not every evening ended in more entertainment, but many did, because a mind that has carried a kingdom all day does not always fall asleep on command. We move into those quieter corners of royal time. The gentle concentration of games like chess, the comfort of reading and listening, the calm of enclosed gardens, and the slow ways a ruler tried to rest his thoughts without needing a crowd. Final warmth begins to thin. The palace does not become empty, only quieter. The great hall gives way to smaller rooms where the ceilings feel lower, the voices softer, the light steadier. This is the time of night when a king might finally stop being the center of a wide circle and become the center of a small one. Not a crowd, not a ceremony, just a handful of familiar faces, and long pauses where nothing urgent must happen. In those hours, leisure turns inward. The body rests, the mind wanders. A ruler who spent the day surrounded by demands could now choose an activity that asked for focus without danger, thought without consequence. That is where the quiet pastimes appear. A board brought to a table, pieces arranged with care, a cup set down gently, a fire kept low so it warms rather than roars. Even the servants move differently now. They do not announce their presence. They glide, they wait, they listen for small needs. The king's comfort depends on this softness, on the feeling that the world is still under control but no longer pressing. The most valuable luxury is not another dish or another performance. It is predictability, a calm hour that will not suddenly turn into an argument, or a crisis, or a negotiation. In that calm, small activities become surprisingly powerful. They do not change the kingdom. They change the king's breathing. They lower the speed of his thoughts. And sometimes, for a few minutes, they allow him to feel like a person again. Someone who can simply sit, concentrate, and let the rest of life wait these hours perfectly because they are quiet by nature. No horses, no crowds, no shouting across a hall. Only a table and a small universe of rules. Chess, especially, suited the royal temperament of many courts. Structured, patient, and deeply symbolic without needing to say anything aloud. The board is a landscape that never changes, yet every move changes its meaning. A king could look at the same pieces for an hour and still see new paths. That slow unfolding is soothing for sleep. The mind begins to follow gentle patterns, repeating possibilities, narrowing choices, and letting the day's chaos dissolve into clean geometry. It is easy to imagine a medieval ruler leaning forward slightly, candlelight catching the edges of carved pieces, fingers hovering before committing. He does not need to speak much. He may only murmur a thought, or offer a quiet invitation for the other player to begin. Sometimes the opponent would be a trusted advisor, sometimes a visiting noble, sometimes a friend from youth whose presence carried no political sharpness. In that setting, conversation becomes optional. The game can hold the silence safely, and in a life where silence often meant tension, waiting for bad news, waiting for a messenger, this kind of silence meant something else. Safety, control, and time that belongs to no one but the gentle echo of leadership, which is part of why it fascinated medieval elites. It allowed the king to think strategically without blood, to practice patience without punishment, to experience rivalry without real risk. Each piece had a role, and the roles mattered. You could not ask one piece to do the work of another. You could not win by force alone. You needed timing, restraint, and the willingness to sacrifice something small for something larger. That is a calm kind of thinking, slow, layered, and quietly satisfying. And unlike many public entertainments, chess did not require a large household to function. It traveled well. A king on the move could take a small set with him. A king recovering from illness could play without leaving his chamber. A storm outside could make the castle feel sealed and heavy, but inside, the board would remain clear and bright under a lamp. There is also something intimate about it. Two people facing each other with a shared agreement to follow rules. No one interrupts. No one demands attention. Even the presence of servants fades into the background because the game needs so little. For sleep, that minimalism is perfect. The mind relaxes when it senses that nothing complicated is required. The goal is simple. The moves are limited. The world shrinks to a manageable size. And when the game ends, it ends cleanly. Pieces gathered, board folded, candle lowered. Not every king preferred a game of pure skill. Some nights called for chance, for the small thrill of uncertainty contained in something harmless. Dice games offered that. A handful of bones or carved cubes, a cup to shake them in, a brief moment of suspense, and then the quiet clatter on wood. In the best version of this scene, it stays gentle. No loud betting, no anger, no desperate risk. Just a light excitement that fades quickly, like a spark that does not become a fire. Moralists often worried about gambling, and some rulers certainly took it too far. But many people in many places use dice more like we use casual games today, as a way to pass time, to laugh softly, to forget the day's wait for a few minutes. It is easy to see why the temptation existed. A king's life could feel predetermined. Duties, expectations, endless repetition. Chance, in a small, controlled form, offers the illusion of escape from inevitability. It also changes the mood of a room. Chess creates long silences. Dice creates short ones. A quick throw, a quiet reaction, a mild comment, another throw. The pace is different, more like drifting than climbing. And drifting is what the mind wants before sleep. If the room remains warm, if the voices remain low, if nothing important is at stake, the game becomes less about winning and more about letting time flow, letting the later than chess in many European courts. And at first they were unusual enough to feel exotic. Early decks were not cheap objects. They could be painted by hand, decorated with symbols that pleased a specific household, and kept carefully like something halfway between a toy and a piece of art. Their appeal was variety. With the same deck, you could play different games depending on mood, some dependent on memory, some on luck, some on reading other players' faces. That made cards ideal for the late evening when energy changes. If the room feels too quiet, a livelier game can wake it gently. If the room feels too active, a calmer game can slow it again. In a king's private circle, cards also allowed more people to participate than chess usually does. That mattered because the king often needed a buffer between solitude and crowd. Too many people created pressure. Too few could create loneliness. A small table game provided the middle ground. A comfortable group, soft conversation, shared attention that does not demand emotional exposure. For a ruler, that is a kind of safety. He can be present without revealing too much. He can watch others speak while he rests. He can smile at a clever play, nod at a joke, and let the night move forward without forcing himself to perform leadership at contests that required no objects at all, only words. Riddles, gentle puzzles, playful challenges of wit. Someone asks a question with a hidden answer, and the room holds a short silence while minds search through familiar images. Animals, tools, weather, scripture, the shapes of daily life. The pleasure here is not intensity, but recognition. The answer often feels obvious only after it is said, and that creates a soft satisfaction, like finding something you misplaced. Word games could stretch longer, turning into friendly competitions that lasted through an hour without anyone noticing time pass. For courts that valued eloquence, this kind of leisure carried social meaning. A clever response suggested education. A calm response suggested confidence. But in private hours, it could simply be comforting. The king might enjoy listening more than speaking, letting his companions entertain each other while he rests within their voices. In that way, wordplay becomes like low music, patterned, rhythmic, and not demanding. Can also be deeply human. A king is surrounded by people who want something from him. But in a riddle game, for a moment, nobody is asking for land or favor. They are asking only for an answer. That is a smaller request than kings usually face. Books can feel a different kind of quiet, one that depended on solitude or near solitude. Literacy among rulers varied, but even kings who did not read easily could be read to, and many enjoyed it. A manuscript in the medieval world was not casual. It was heavy, valuable, slow to create. Pages held the labor of scribes, the patience of artists, the expense of materials. To open such a book at night was to enter a space where time moved differently. Slower, steadier, more deliberate. The king might choose a text that matched his mood, a history that made the present feel less urgent by placing it inside a long chain of events, a moral work that soothed anxiety by offering order and meaning, a story that carried him away from the court's sharp edges, or practical writing on animals, on plants, on medicine, that allowed curiosity without danger. The act of listening to reading can be especially sleep-friendly. A voice continues at a gentle pace. The listener's eyes can soften. The mind follows a line of thought without needing to create one. In a world where the king usually must produce decisions, listening is restful because it makes him a receiver rather than a maker. It gives him permission to stop shaping reality for a while and simply let words wash over him. Reading stayed private, it was never completely disconnected from power. A king who gathered books gathered prestige. A small library suggested seriousness, education, and connection to learned people who could advise him. But in the late hours, the political layer could fade. A book could become a personal object, something handled often, pages worn, corners softened by repeated touch. Imagine a candle burning low beside the text, the room warm enough to remove heavy outer clothing, and the king allowing himself to sink into a chair rather than sit upright. Outside, the castle settles into night noises. Distant footsteps, a door closing, wind brushing stone. Inside, the page remains steady. Some manuscripts were illuminated, filled with color that seemed to glow even in weak light. That glow could be comforting, like a small garden painted onto parchment. The king might pause not because he is confused, but because he is simply looking at a margin decoration, at a tiny figure, at a pattern repeated patiently. In that pause, the mind becomes quiet. It is no longer chasing tomorrow. It is resting in detail. That is one of the gentlest forms of leisure, attention without urgency. And when the book closes, it closes like a soft door. The world does not collapse. Some kings preferred a different quiet. The garden. Not a working field, not a farm, but an enclosed space shaped for calm. High walls protected it from wind and noise, creating a little pocket of different air. In daylight, the garden could impress visitors, but in the private hours it could belong to the ruler alone or to a chosen companion. The path might be straight and simple, bordered by herbs and flowers, designed not for wild surprise but for order. That order mattered. After days of conflict, political or personal, an ordered garden offered a small proof that harmony was possible. Water features were especially soothing. A fountain that did not shout but murmured. A channel that guided water along a line. A pool that held reflections steady. In a sleep-friendly telling, this scene becomes slow and gentle. Footsteps on gravel. The faint scent of crushed leaves. The soft shift of shadows across stone. The king does not need to speak. Walking itself becomes the activity, the steady rhythm of movement loosening thoughts. The garden does not argue. It does not demand. It simply grows slowly and faithfully, and invites the mind to slow quiet usefulness. Many plants were chosen not only for beauty but for scent, flavor, and simple remedies. Roses could please the eye and also become part of perfumes or medicines. Herbs could be gathered for the household. Fruit trees could offer blossoms in spring and sweetness later in the year. None of this needed to feel like work for the king. Could feel like a gentle lesson. Life can be nurtured, not only commanded. That contrast may be part of why gardens mattered so much to rulers. Kings lived among commands and punishments, among threats and rewards. A garden answered those methods slowly. If you neglect it, it fades. If you tend it, it returns beauty quietly, without applause. That is a different kind of relationship with the world, one that can soften a ruler's inner life. And there is also privacy in a garden that a palace cannot always provide. Even within walls, conversations can travel. In a garden, open-air swallows sound. A king could speak to one person without the feeling that the entire court is listening through stone. Or he could speak to no one at all, letting the evening become only footsteps and breath, until the mind begins to settle. The king returned indoors. The castle's energy had dropped to its lowest level. Fires were banked. The busiest tasks were done. What remained were small routines. A final drink of water, a cloak folded, a candle replaced with a smaller one. These routines mattered more than they seem because they signaled transition. They told the body gently that the day was closing. In a medieval world, where nights could be genuinely dark and weather could press against stone, bedtime was not just personal, it was practical. Yet even bedtime carried quiet ceremony. Some rulers preferred to be alone at the last moment. Others felt safer with a trusted attendant nearby. Either way, the goal was similar: to create a pocket of peace inside a life that rarely offered it. In that pocket, a game might end unfinished without anyone caring. A book might be marked and set aside. The garden might remain in memory as a cool scent. The king's mind could begin to drift, not because every problem was solved, but because the night finally allowed him to stop solving. We move into the most private layer of these secret hours: devotion and small rituals of comfort, personal relationships, and the unusual curiosities that some rulers pursued in quiet, handled gently, without harshness, and always with the soft pacing that makes sleep come easier. A medieval palace did not suddenly fall silent. It softened gradually, like a fire sinking into embers. The busiest corridors emptied first. Footsteps became less frequent, and when they did pass, they sounded careful, as if the building itself were sleeping and no one wished to wake it. A draft slid along the stone, carrying the faint smell of smoke and wax. In the great hall, benches were pushed back into place, and the last crumbs were cleared from tables that had held abundance only an hour before. What remained was a quieter kind of order. Doors secured, lamps lowered, the household turning inward. For a king, this slow dimming mattered. Daytime made him public by default. Even leisure could carry witnesses. But night rearranged the world into smaller circles, smaller duties, smaller expectations. The rhythm of court life was still present. There were still guards, still attendants, still someone awake to receive urgent news. But the pressure eased in layers. If the hunt and the banquet were forms of staged power, the late hours were something else. The ordinary need to be warm, to be safe, to be untroubled for long enough that sleep could arrive. And in that need, the king became less like a symbol and more like any person who has carried too much through the day and now wants the simplest thing of all. Public rooms to private ones was often a small journey through increasing quiet. Passing doorways felt like passing thresholds of attention. A chamber might hold only a low fire, a chair, a few personal objects, things chosen not to impress, but to comfort. Clothing changed as well. Heavy ceremonial layers gave way to softer fabrics meant for warmth and ease rather than display. A basin of water might be brought for washing hands and face, and in colder seasons, the water could be warmed so it did not shock the skin. These details sound modest, yet they formed a nightly ritual that told the body the day had ended. Even when the king could not be alone, the atmosphere could still feel private, because the tasks were familiar and repeated. An attendant knew where to place a cloak, how to bank the fire, when to speak and when not to. A ruler accustomed to noise could relax into the predictability. Nothing in this moment required strategy. Nothing demanded persuasion. There was only the simple management of comfort. Warmth against stone, light against darkness. A room arranged so that the mind could gradually stop. A medieval castle required planning. Stone held cold, and wind found its way through tiny openings. Beds were built to protect warmth, thick coverings, layered textiles, sometimes curtains drawn around the sleeping space to hold heat and reduce drafts. The bed was not merely furniture. It was a small shelter inside a larger shelter. In some places and periods, a ruler might also take a light meal or a warm drink late, not as another feast, but as quiet reassurance against hunger waking him in the night. The goal was steadiness. No sharp discomfort that could pull the mind back into alertness. When the fire was lowered and the candles replaced with smaller ones, The room shifted into a softer palette of light. Shadows moved slowly over walls. The sounds of the castle became distant. A guard's step, the faint clink of a chain, a door closing far away. In that setting, even a king could begin to feel the gentle pull of sleep. Not because his responsibilities disappeared, but because the world finally stopped asking him to answer. The last hours of the day also carried a spiritual dimension that could be surprisingly calming. Devotion did not always mean grand public ceremony. It could be a short prayer spoken quietly, a familiar set of words repeated until they became as steady as breathing. A small book of prayers might be opened by candlelight, not to study, but to anchor the mind. In a world where illness and sudden death were constant possibilities, faith offered a kind of structure that politics could not. It provided language for fear and a way to place tomorrow's uncertainty into a larger story. Even if the king's piety was mixed with duty and appearance during the day, the night could feel different. In private, there was less reason to perform. The words could be simple: gratitude for survival, hope for wisdom, a request for protection over family and household. For sleep, this is one of the gentlest scenes to imagine. A quiet room, a low flame, a ruler letting the day's weight slide. Slowly, respectfully, the king did not want more thinking at all. He wanted the opposite, to be carried by something that required no decision. This is where soft storytelling or quiet music could return, not as entertainment for a hall, but as a private comfort. A familiar voice might read aloud from a text that was neither urgent nor challenging. A short tale, a calm moral example, a passage that moved steadily from sentence to sentence like footsteps on an even path. If music was present, it could be reduced to its simplest form: a gentle melody, a repeated pattern, a sound designed not to excite but to settle. The purpose was not to impress anyone. It was to smooth the mind into rest. The best nighttime atmosphere is never sharp. It is round-edged, slow, and safe. And in those moments, the king's power mattered less than his humanity. Sleep does not arrive because one commands it. It arrives because the body feels permitted to let go. A ruler's mind could hold unfinished things. A king might ask for a trusted person, not a crowd, just one steady presence. The relationship could be practical, emotional, or both. Someone who could hear a worry without spreading it. Someone who could speak plainly without turning every sentence into politics. Late hours were when private words could be spoken. Doubts about an advisor, anxiety about a distant border, fatigue that could never be admitted in the daytime. Sometimes quiet correspondence belonged here as well. A letter might be dictated or written not for proclamation but for something closer. A message to a relative, a note to a friend, a few careful sentences meant to preserve connection across distance. These are not loud moments. They are slow and measured. The ink dries. The seal is pressed. The letter becomes a small object carrying the king's voice into tomorrow. And once it is done, the mind can relax slightly, because something unspoken has finally been placed somewhere sharpened awareness of vulnerability. A king slept with guards awake, because danger did not end when candles were lowered. Yet safety routines could be soothing in their own way, precisely because they were routine. Doors checked, watches assigned, corridors controlled. These actions reduced chaos into procedure. The king did not need to patrol his own protection. Others held that responsibility, allowing him to rest. In a sleep-friendly telling, this is not a frightening image. It is a steady one. a fortress designed to hold the night outside while warmth remains within. The household becomes like a living creature settling down. Some parts asleep, some parts quietly awake, all moving according to a rhythm repeated so many times that it feels natural. The king can finally become still because stillness is supported. The building, the staff, the habits of the place, all of them are designed to make one thing possible: that the ruler survives the night and returns to near silence. The last candle shortens. The fire dims into a gentle glow. Fabric settles. Breathing slows. Outside, wind moves over the dark shapes of trees, and somewhere far from the king's chamber, an owl calls once and then stops. In the end, the secret hours are not only about grand pastimes. They are about the quiet work of becoming restful again. A medieval king could chase a stag, preside over a feast, win a game, walk in an enclosed garden. Yet none of those things mattered if he could not sleep. Sleep was the final privilege and the final necessity, the one ritual that turned power back into a human body that needed warmth, safety, and time. If you continue this series with a second video, you can step into other corners of court life, collections, curiosities, private fascinations, without disturbing the calm of this first journey. For now, it is enough to let the palace darken, to let the day close, and to leave the king where all people must eventually arrive, in stillness with the night gently holding the world in place.